From the middle of the 20th century, tourism grew exponentially, as did the adverse environmental impact, as pristine nature was converted to tourist resorts, historic sites were overwhelmed by unprecedented visitors, and greenhouse gases were generated in moving people around and cooling and heating them in hotels. We will see in this chapter how waste and tourism, more profit-driven than the romantics and hippies discussed so far, could have green benefits more by the nature of their activities than by the ecological zeal of their entrepreneurs. In the matter of waste, reduce, reuse, recycle was a business model before it became a green mantra. Prodded by municipal concerns for public health, early waste companies developed environmentally friendly practices which remain in use today. Likewise, entrepreneurs in tourism were motivated more by profit than by ecological commitments, but by monetizing the appreciation of nature, they created profit-driven incentives to preserve it. In both industries, the results were mixed. Environmental benefits went hand in hand with environmental damage. If chapters 1 through 3 were about unusual people becoming unlikely entrepreneurs, this chapter addresses businesses which contributed to sustainability almost by accident. The waste industry, an abundance of garbage. As industrial capitalism created growing wealth in the 19th century, it also created abundant waste, or as it was mainly known before the 1960s, rubbish, refuse, or garbage. There was nothing new about waste, but the amount began to grow exponentially as Western populations, increasingly urban, soared. In pre-industrial societies, the amount of waste, certainly in rural areas, was limited. Low incomes meant that there was every incentive to reuse old textiles and metals, while organic kitchen waste and animal carcasses were used for fodder or glue, and bodily wastes as fertilizer. While in the past, most goods were made from simple materials which were biodegradable, this was increasingly not true in the industrial age, especially as glass and metal packaging increased. There was also rapid growth in industrial waste, like spent coals from new manufacturing processes. Over time, materials and food became literally wasted because rising incomes enabled people to buy new products even when they did not need them, and to buy more food than they needed to survive. The growth of consumerism resulted in what one American cultural historian called a throwaway society, based on the rejection of older habits of care for or stewardship of objects. By the new century, Americans were already producing far more waste per capita than Europeans. In 1905, for instance, the U.S. per capita rate across 14 cities was about 860 pounds annually. Meanwhile, across 77 German cities, the rate was 319 pounds. Across Europe, consumers retained habits of thrift and reuse much longer than their American counterparts. By the 20th century, waste became endemic. It was driven by affluence, increasingly quick fashion cycles, and technological advances which made products redundant after a few years. The amount of waste horrified environmentalist writers. In Road to Survival, published in 1948, William Vogt lamented the waster's psychology. The problem was not merely that scarce resources were being consumed with no sense of stewardship for the planet. A greater problem still was what happened to the waste. Household waste was typically dumped in open pits. Sometimes it was dumped in the oceans. Industrial and chemical waste was dumped into rivers. Although for many decades accepted as the cost of progress and inevitable externalities, as noted in the last chapter, by the 1960s, rivers were foaming and catching fire, and protests spread beyond ecological activists. The traditional practices for dealing with waste were in some respects highly sustainable. As waste mounted in the 19th century, thousands of scavengers collected and recycled waste throughout Europe and the United States.